she'll sit there and have a drink and a half.
That's alcohol abuse.
That's the terrible abuse of alcohol, right? And she's not alcoholic. And you know what? When she talks about finding out she's not, it sounds like me talking about finding out I am, because you know what? They're both the same experience. They're two people finding out their own truth. Let's come back at 20 after 8.
Say hi to Rick.
So this one time through the steps, we started to look at the first step in 3 parts. And we spent a week on the craving, a week on the obsession, and a week on the spiritual malady. And I was using this prayer. And during the week that we were looking at the craving, I woke up 3 days in a row with going on in my head without me. You know the difference between waking up and starting to think about something and waking up and something's already going on in your mind without you, like fear or anger or worry or joy or whatever it might be. And I woke up for 3 days in a row with going on in my head without me, doubt about whether I had this craving for alcohol ever. And I'd looked at it 9 other times. And I'd looked at it with a lot of people, one-on-one, that I was working with. And with that doubt, I knew the prayer was working. I knew the prayer was working because something I was sure about the day before, I was wondering about the next day. And that's how it feels sometimes when this set-aside prayer begins to work. That doesn't mean I didn't find out what I already knew. That meant I had a new experience with what I thought I already knew. Because, see, you can't start a spiritual process with an answer. And you can't start and if you start a spiritual process with an answer, you end up with what you already started with. And believe it or not, the basic question that this process starts with is, am I powerless over alcohol? Am I alcoholic? And if you start with an answer to that question, you've cut the process off. You've cut the experience off by answering the question. So what do? You leave the question open and you look at a series of questions from both sides. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. It's my question to you all tonight. Which would be worse, for all of us to find out we're really alcoholic or to find out we're not? It's not great. I hate to tell you, but it's not great news to find out that you're alcoholic. Because to find out you're alcoholic means no human power can relieve what you have. Nothing short of a spiritual awakening. And I think with whatever step anybody in this room is having trouble with currently, it's because of your step 1 awareness. Not that you don't know it up here, but that you don't know it down here. For example, I go to a man one time and I'd been through the steps and I had 4 amends left from that year's inventory. I had 4 amends that I was currently aware of. And I said, Mike, I'm having trouble with amends. He said, well, you're 9 years sober. Do you know how to make amends? I said, yeah. He said, do you know who the amends are to? I said, yeah. He said, then I don't think that you're having trouble with amends. I think you're having trouble with the last word of the 8th step, which is the most overlooked word in all 12 steps. And you'll have to look at what the last word in the 8th step is to see what the most overlooked word in the 12 steps is. He said, and I don't think you're really having trouble becoming entirely ready to make them all, but I think you're having trouble with what you asked to be removed in 6 and 7 because you're not really clear on the exact nature of the wrong that you admitted in step 5, because your writing probably wasn't really clear, because you're not really sure about this decision you made about you and God, because you're not really clear that you chose Him to be everything, and you're not really sure that you're alcoholic. And I saw the direct connection between my resistance in step 9 and my doubt about being alcoholic. Not up here. The conscious awareness that I am alcoholic and I can't keep myself sober. If that was really in my consciousness at 9, I wouldn't be having any trouble with 9. So it's my contention when somebody in this room thinks they're having trouble with step 2, it's not about step 2. Next time, and you can check this out and see if it's true, next time you hear somebody who's having trouble with step 2, talk to them about step 1. Next time you hear somebody having trouble with step 4, talk to them about what they really decided in step 2 and 3. And 1. Next time you hear somebody having trouble with step 9, ask them if those 9th step amends have anything to do with whether they might drink again or not. And you'll find out the steps aren't just single entities floating around out here in space, that they're directly connected to each other. They're also not a straight line. The steps are a circle. And that's where I'd like to start tonight, on the title page of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous.
My name's Mark. I'm an alcoholic.
Those of you that have a book that has no circle and triangle anymore because of a conference decision, you can draw a circle and triangle in your book where it used to be, and what goes on there is unity, recovery, and service. Unity along the left, recovery along the bottom, and service up the right. And it is a symbol used by Alcoholics Anonymous for a long time. But that's the page we're going to look at now, the page that has the title, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism.
As we go through this, I want to give you some tools. You might want to make a note. These are tools that have been very helpful. The first tool is let your experience show you your truth, not anybody else's. Let your experience show you your truth as we begin to go through the book. That's number one. Because my mind will lie to me, but my experience won't lie to me about my truth. When we start looking at, am I physically powerless over alcohol, let your experience show you that. That's one tool. I want to give you another tool. I discovered that I'm so selfish and self-centered when the Big Book uses the word we, I think they're talking about you. So when I go through the book, I put my name in, and when I do that, the book speaks to my condition. So that's another tool that I will give you. Put your name in the book. Another tool I want to give you I think is important, particularly from the third step on. Anytime the Big Book uses the word it, make sure you know what it is. It's amazing what you can skip over. The other thing that I would ask you to be aware of is anytime the Big Book uses the word if. The word if means a condition. And also as we go through, we kind of come from the school that anytime this book makes a statement, a hope, it's a promise. So we just got one on the title page of this book. I don't know how you drank, but I'll tell you this. When I came to AA October the 19th of 1982, I weighed about 250 pounds, somewhere in there. I had brain damage, kidney damage, liver damage, and everything I own's in a duffel bag. So when the title page said, Mark, this is the story of many thousands of men, women have recovered from alcoholism, that put some hope in me. This big book is full of promises. Any statement of hope is a promise. We've deified the ones in 82 and 83. You will see as we go through this weekend, there is promise after promise after promise in this big book. Not just pages 82 and 83. It starts with the title page. I'll share a couple things about this circle and triangle. The thing I love most more than anything in my life is sitting in my room at my house working one-on-one with an alcoholic, and when I start, I follow the instructions in the big book, and that is that I have them go buy a new big book, because I seem to sponsor one of two kinds of people. I either sponsor people that have black belts in relapse, or I sponsor people who had my experience of being in AA, dying of untreated alcoholism, who had no experience or very little experience with the steps. And so I asked them to read the big book, and then on the second visit I had them come over, and I asked them if they decided to go through with the 12 steps of the program of recovery. It tells me that in working with others. Now, there's two other questions I asked them before I opened the title page. And we read them in Chapter 5 every time in every meeting. Here's what they are. Have you decided you want what we have? And then I tell them what we have. And then I ask them another question. Are you willing to go to any length? Because the big book says, Mark, you need to decide if you want what we have and ask yourself if you're willing to go to any length, and then you're ready to take certain steps. I've learned through sponsoring a lot of people over the years that this stuff I do in the front end before we start working this book is important. Now, the other thing is I'm not the kind of guy who won't tell you what willing to go to any length is. I'll tell you exactly what willing to go to any length is. It means we're going to go from the title page of this book to page 164, and every time it gives us direction, we're going to do exactly what it says.
So here's a great assignment you can give somebody, and it's also based on a statement from page 76. Page 76 says, remember, it was agreed at the beginning that you would go to any length for victory over alcohol. So where are we? We're at the beginning. And here's how it usually goes for me. I'll speak somewhere, or I'll meet someone at a meeting, and they'll say they're interested in this work, or they'll come to my home group. And the initial thing is they got to show me they're interested. I don't care if it's 3 days or 30 years. I'm not going to treat any of them any different. And the chapter Working with Others actually asks you to put yourself in their shoes and ask how you would like to be treated if the tables were turned. And this is exactly what was done with me. I'll ask them to call. I'll give them a card. Then if they call, they follow through that far, I'll ask them to come to my home group. If they're not out of town, if they're in town, they'll come to my home group. I'll say, let's talk, call me again. And if they call me again, I'm going to give them this assignment. Read the first 164 pages and answer these 4 questions. Is this work what you want to do? Don't confuse want with can. Like when you're reading about the 9th step and you think, gosh, am I going to have to do that? No. If you don't get more power than you currently have from 1 through 8, you're not going to do 9. But do I want to do this work? Number 2, am I willing to go to any length to do this work? These are directly from page 58, how it works, and page 76 in the 8th step. Number 3, I'd like to know why. Why do you want to do this work? And I'll give you a little hint. When they come back in a month or so and they've done this assignment, and number 3, why, doesn't have to do with booze, they're not going to get through this work. But I'll talk to them about it. It should have something to do with alcohol. Number 4, I want them to tell me why they want to do it with me. Just to hear. And number 5, which isn't directly from the book, I'm going to ask them to tell me about what areas of your life are you currently being dishonest about with yourself and or others. And I'll tell you what, this assignment weeds out a lot of bullshitters. And it also takes out a lot of resistance in the ones that follow through on it. And they have a lot less resistance in steps 4 through 9 because there's something to agreeing to this work. And I think the people that wrote this book knew that there was something to, at the beginning, agreeing, and it does something to appease the human ego. I don't know what that's all about, but I know the Native American man that gave this to me when I was 8 years sober said that he'd given it to a lot of people, and he actually believes there's something to involving the ego, because you are up against it when you start this work. There's something to involving the ego in this decision from the very beginning.
So, when I sit down with someone, that's what takes place before we ever get to the title page. All right? To me, what sponsorship is all about is one thing and one thing only. And that is taking somebody through working the steps. That's what sponsorship is to me. And it is work. I guarantee you it is work. So once we've done all this, then we sit down and we look at this title page. And we look at this circle and this triangle, and if it's not in the book, we draw it in the book, and I'll tell you why we do this. Because at 3 years sober, I had done the things I'd been told in Alcoholics Anonymous. They said go to meetings. They said get a home group. I did that. They said get a sponsor. My first 3 years, I had 2. I'll pass on something to you I learned. If a blind man finds a blind man to lead him around, they're both going in the ditch. And I went in the ditch. A sponsor can only give you the experience they've had. Over and over, the big book uses the word experience. So what happened to me, I'm going to meetings like you told me. I had a home group. I went to big book studies. I'm sounding like a parrot, sharing experiences I've never had with you all. And what happened to me is within about 3 years, my life got tremendously better. Just by the elimination of alcohol and praying to a God that I knew nothing about and certainly wasn't having a conscious awareness of, although that power's always been there. And this condition in me called the spirituality is getting worse, and it's getting worse, and I don't even know what words to use to describe it. I do now. Restless, irritable, discontent. There's a paragraph on page 52 that describes it. Some of you may be suffering from it right now in this room. It says Mark's having trouble in personal relationships. Start with yourself. Says Mark can't control his emotional nature. Says Mark's a prey to misery and depression. Says Mark can't make a living. Says Mark's full of fear. Says Mark feels useless. Says Mark cannot be of help to others. That's untreated alcoholism. And at 3 years, I was dying of that. And I kept getting worse. And here's what I couldn't understand. This was something I finally got free of. My external world was looking better. I'd bought my first home. There's 2 cars in the garage. I got a job. I'm making about $40,000 a year. I got a home brook and a bunch of friends in my life. So why am I dying inside? What's going on with me? These 2 men could only give me what's been given to them. One of them sat me down at Denny's. In 15 seconds, we went through the first 72 pages of the big book. He asked me 3 stupid questions. You think you're an alcoholic? Yeah. I didn't have a clue. I'm telling you I'm an alcoholic, but I didn't have a clue. Second question he asked me was, do you believe in God? Yeah. Third question, he says, you ready to make a decision, turn your will and life over to the care of God? Yeah. We did a prayer in Denny's. I wrote a piece of horse manure inventory, did a 5th step. Can't even remember what I did with 6 and 7 with him. I made a list of amends. I had 8 people in the list. Hell, there's more people than that in my blood family. I missed a lot. I missed a hell of a lot. Then I did what a lot of us maybe have done in this room is, I'm going to blame my sponsor if I'm not getting much better, so I went and got another sponsor. And I had much the same experience. But this condition inside me, the spirituality, is getting worse and worse because, see, alcohol ain't my problem. I suffer from a spiritual illness. And that means only a power greater than myself can treat it. And the steps are the method in which that power treats it, but I wasn't doing the steps. I was doing everything but AA. So finally, at about 3 years, I went to Don, and I sat down with him, and he took the circle and triangle. And a simple explanation of the circle and triangle spoke to my spiritual condition. See, here's the other thing I know about the steps. I don't care how long you're sober. It'll speak to your spiritual condition. So here's what he said to me. He asked me what I thought recovery was. And I said, well, working the steps. So he asked me if I'd ever done that. Now, this is another interesting observation I made. Alcoholics cannot answer yes or no questions. We have been so dishonest for so long and bullshit so many people. We have to go into elaborate explanations on a simple yes or no question. Well, I begin to do that with him. And he stopped me and said, from now on in our relationship, when I ask you a yes or no question, I'd like a yes or no response. So he said, let me ask you this again. Have you ever gone through the big book with someone and done everything it said? And I said, no. Then he said, you're not in recovery and you've never been in recovery. Now, here was something else I learned at that point in time. He cared more about me as a child of God than he gave a shit about my sensitive little feelings. And I am grateful that he did that. The men and women in my life today who saved my life love me more as a child of God than they care about my sensitive little feelings. Because what if my feelings come from my thought life, and what if my thought life centered on me all the time? You see? So basically I discovered that in 3 years in the program I'm not in recovery thinking I'm in recovery, because recovery's working the 12 steps. You either work the steps or you haven't. And this is a 12-step program, folks. It's not a 4-step program, a 3-step, an 8.5, a 9.5, or a 10.5. It's a 12-step program. Did you do that, Mark? No. So I'm not in recovery. That's my truth. So he asked me about unity. Well, that's the fellowship, going to meetings. Were you in that? Yeah, I was in that. I got him now, right? So I'm in that part of the fellowship. So he says, well, you're taking your body to meetings. Uh-huh. So what do you think service is? Well, that's emptying ashtrays and coffee. And he laughed, which he did then and still does a lot today, and says, Mark, if you're willing to go through this work, if you want what we have, when we get to the 10th step, you'll have entered the world of the Spirit, and you will take your awakened spirit out to be a service to God and your fellow human beings in every area of your life. But since you've never worked the steps, that hasn't happened, so you're not in that part of the program either. Let me explain, Mark, what's going on with you 3 years sober. You're in one part of a 3-part program expecting the results of the other 2, and that's why you're suffering from a spiritual illness. You do not feel whole, Mark. This circle represents whole, at one with God. And everything he said was true. When we met Rick in Taos, he stumbled into a big book workshop. Almost 7 years sober? Absolutely dying of untreated alcoholism. He was in the same place I was at 3 years. This circle and triangle was so important to me because all of a sudden it opened up and explained to me what this program was. And you know, we read this in meetings all the time. Our primary purpose is to stay sober, right? Now here's my dilemma. I don't have the power to do that. So the first legacy they gave us is recovery. That's working the steps, because in working the steps, all of them I develop a relationship with God. The second legacy is the fellowship. If I'm not working the steps and have a relationship with God, you know what I'm bringing to meetings? I'm bringing my illness to the meetings. And then if I'm not working the steps and have a relationship with God, and I'm going to meetings, my service consists of my carrying my message to you instead of this message. I'd sponsored 3 men when I hooked up with Don, and I went back and made amends to those 3 men because I didn't carry the message of this book to them. I carried my message. That was a little bit of information from the book, some from the grapevine, a whole bunch of bullshit. Wasn't this message. I will not be an accessory to murder today because I'll tell you something about this illness. I work at a treatment center. This illness kills. Those of us in this room, we have a chance. But this illness kills. I will not be an accessory to murder. And there's 2 things I always do to guarantee that doesn't happen. Every time I sit down with a drunk, I invite God in. And every time I sit down with a drunk, this big book is open between us so that I carry my experience with this message. I don't give you my opinion on how to recover from a hopeless state of mind, body, and spirit. Because here's what I know today. If every treatment center in this country closed in every hospital, you know where we go to get sober? We come to AA. And all these psychiatrists and all these therapists, you know where they get sober? Come to get sober and get well? They come to AA. And you know where all these priests and nuns come to get sober? They come to Alcoholics Anonymous. It's about having an experience with the power. So the circle and the triangle is so important to me, has been important to my experience, and I really spend some time going over it. And when I'm done, this brand new person, and some of you are new, you're getting the gift of hearing tonight what it means to be in Alcoholics Anonymous. It means I'm working the steps out of the big book because I'm seeking God, because I don't have any power to keep myself sober. It means I'm going to the fellowship, but it means more than just going to meetings. We hide out in meetings. It means I'm part of a home group, and I go to group consciousness, and I'm really in there because I care about this. And then it means being a service in every area of my life from the time I get up till the time I go to bed, not just with other alcoholics, everywhere that I go. And when I do that, then I feel whole. You see, I'm at one. I am at one with God. I am at peace with me. If I'm at peace with God and I'm at peace with me, then I'm at peace with you. Joe?
When I was 5.5 months sober, somewhere before I was 6 months sober, I was given the grace to see the nature of my condition further away from my last drink than I'd ever been. In 18 years of drinking and using drugs, I never had 30 days. And that was in 10 treatment centers and the Michigan State Penitentiary and several jails. I never had 30 days. I had 28 days here, 28 days there, 20, 21, 7, 5. I never had 30 days in 18 years. And here I was 5.5 months dry in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I woke up one day and I was dying of a part of the disease I didn't even know I had, and I didn't know the description of it. I didn't know the description of it is in this book, and I didn't know what was wrong. And once again, there I am with that basic alcoholic question in the back of my mind that we're all so very familiar with, whether it was before you ever took a drink, whether it was during the alcoholism, whether it was after you stopped drinking but you're in the alcoholism, or whether it's when the alcoholism is getting worse and you're not drinking and you don't know why. There's that question. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And at 5.5 months, I'm further away from what I think is the problem than I've ever been. And I thought, because they told me in 5 or 6 treatment centers, Joe, alcohol and drugs are your problem, and if you just put them aside, everything would be all right. And after about 5 or 6 treatment centers, I wanted to say to those people, what do you mean alcohol and drugs are my problem? They're the only thing that ever do anything for me anymore. They're the only thing that ever take that pain away. And they're not even working that well anymore. What do you mean they're the problem? And every time I put them aside, it doesn't get better. It gets worse. So I quit buying the idea that alcohol and drugs were my problem. I saw early on that alcohol and drugs were my solution to a much deeper problem, except this solution quit working way before I quit drinking. I drank way past when alcohol was working anymore. And at 5.5 months, I'm confused because I'm further away from my last drink than I've ever been, and I'm worse. And for 5.5 months, I'd been loving the fellowship. I'd been having fun. I was on this pink cloud. I was making friends. I loved the fellowship. I got a little place to live. I got a little girlfriend. I got a little money. And I woke up one day and page 52 was me. And page 52 in the chapter to the agnostic, that middle paragraph describes a state of consciousness that was very familiar to me, but no one ever put it this way. And it described me before I ever took a drink. I don't know if anyone in the room will relate to this, but I can remember sitting in my parents' backyard in a family where I shouldn't have felt this way. Here in Battle Creek, up in Merritt Woods, or whatever, off on the other side of town, wherever that was. And I can remember sitting in their backyard, and I can remember thinking that a spaceship was going to land, and a little green man was going to get out, and he was going to tell me that I wasn't born on this planet, that I'd been brought here as a teeny baby, and that this was just a test, because that's how different and separate and out of place I felt 2 or 3 years before I ever took a drink. And when I read page 52 in the chapter to the agnostic, the middle paragraph, it described how I felt before I ever put any booze in my system. Before my spirit ever got treated, it had a malady. It had an emptiness. It had a separateness to it. Then when alcohol didn't work, during those 18 years, I would end up feeling like page 52. Then, further away from my last drink than I've ever been in 18 years, in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I woke up one day and I was having trouble with personal relationships. I couldn't control my emotions. I was prey to misery and depression. I had a feeling of uselessness. I was full of fear, and I was unhappy. And I called this man I'd heard in my very first meeting, who became my sponsor and has been since. And I went out to his house, and he said he only knew one way to do this, and that was that we were going to start on the title page, and we were going to go all the way through. And he talked to me about a 3-part program for a 3-part disease with 36 spiritual principles. And the whole program that day, after being in this program 6 months or 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, just talking to me about the circle and the triangle, I saw a program that I wasn't in. Because he asked me about unity. He said, where do you find it? And I said, in these meetings, in these rooms, and everything we do with people. He said, are you in that part of the program? I said, yes. He said, welcome. And he read me a page that says, the most powerful desire of is absolutely no avail. And I saw the only requirement for membership to our fellowship is not, never has been, or never will be the only requirement for me to stay sober. He said, what about recovery? See, what he was doing, they slowly put you in a box. It becomes a coffin. That's my first step. I'm 6 months thinking I'm in AA, and I'm finding out I'm not even in the program that I believe I'm in, because he asked me, what about recovery? Where do you find recovery? I said, on the wall. He said, no, dummy, they made a mistake when they put the steps on the wall, because they left the instructions in between out, and they left them up for you to figure out. And you haven't done so well, have you? He said, recovery's in the first 164 pages. Are you doing that? I said, no. He said, what about service? And I got a little mad because my sensitive alcoholic feelings were hurt. And I said, well, I'm taking patients to meetings from where I used to go to treatment. He said, oh, you're carrying alcoholics to the message. There's a big difference. And that didn't feel good either. But I saw that there's 2/3 of a 3-part program I'm not even in. I had no message to carry because I hadn't had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. And I wasn't involved in the steps that were going to give me a spiritual awakening. 2/3 of the program, and I'm not in. And he talked to me about recovery. And he talked to me about carrying the message. And he talked to me about a 3-part disease, body, mind, and spirit. How many of us have heard? Bring the body to the fellowship and the mind will follow. Treat the mind through a spiritual, through the 12 steps, and you have an awakening of the spirit, and you bring that spirit back into the program and out into the world to be of service, and those things will one day become one. And you know what I can say to you today? I don't see these parts of the program as separate. When I'm doing fellowship, you better believe I'm in recovery. And when I'm doing recovery, I'm involved in a fellowship. And when I'm carrying the message, it's about unity and recovery. these 3 parts of the program join to my life, where I don't see AA as something I do over here, and relationships are something I do over here, and work is something I do over here. It became one because I became whole. Then he talked to me about 36 spiritual principles rather than just 12. He talked to me, and I think the saddest thing we hear around this country are the steps are to the individual, what the traditions are to the group. Because you know what that says to the new man? Those traditions aren't for you, they're for this group. You know what Don said to me? There are as many spiritual principles in the traditions for you to practice as an individual whenever you're dealing with more than one person as there are in the steps, as there are in the concepts. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing a 3-part program that I'm not in for a 3-part disease that I definitely have, and I'm expecting the results of a 3-part program hanging out in 1/3 of it. And I saw a program with 36 spiritual principles and another promise contained in the circle that I could become whole. The next day I'm at a noon meeting at this church, and I see the minister, and up over their altar, the meeting looks down into the altar. They used to call it the ski slope meeting, and it looks down into this church. And above this altar are 3 giant circles with triangles. And I went up to the minister one day and I said, "Do you know that's the AA symbol?" And he said, "Yeah, but do you know that it's an ancient spiritual symbol that means body, mind, and spirit as one?" And I said, "My God, that's the same thing my sponsor shared with me, that if I bring my body to the fellowship, my mind to recovery, my spirit to the service, I can become whole." And this whole program opened up to me. He talked to me about the table of contents and where we were going to find the first 3 steps. Because from there on, it's pretty simple. From the time it says, now we're at step 3. Now we're at step 4. Now here's step 5. But a lot of people get confused that everything up to the 3rd step are the first 2. And I don't know why that's so confusing. So what we're going to do is we're going to use everything from the doctor's opinion to the ABCs, where it says, now we're at step 3, to take the first 2 steps. For lack of a better way, and from these things you're going to get on Sunday, you're going to see how we've broken the book into sections. So for section number 1, we're going to look from the title page up to the doctor's opinion. We're going to look at the title page, the table of contents, the preface, and the foreword to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd editions until we get to the doctor's opinion. It's not step 1, but let's look at section 1 as general information about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous.
In the table of contents, those of you have your book, if you would like to, we'll try and break this down a little bit. I want you to consider something else, too. We look at step 1. Basically, everything in the big book, from the doctor's opinion through more about alcoholism through page 43, is really looking at the first half of step 1, the powerlessness. And everything in the big book from the doctor's opinion to page 23 is looking at the body. Why am I physically powerless? And everything from page 23 to 43 is looking at the mind. You see, a lot of people don't understand this, but the relapse ends when you pick the drink up. It doesn't start then. It ends then. Pages 23 to 43 are going to talk to us about the state of mind every one of us is in tonight. We don't have any alcohol in our body. What the hell would propel anyone in this room to put alcohol in their body again? So that's where we're going to look at what's called the obsession of the mind, the mental powerlessness of our illness. Pages 44, half of 45, and a paragraph on page 52 is going to speak to us about the unmanageability of our life. And then everything in We Agnostics up through the ABCs is step 2. You see, when I was asked, where do you find step 1 in the big book, I couldn't answer that. I can answer that today. Now, I want you to think about something else. There's 10 pages in the doctor's opinion, and basically up through page 52, we're going to examine step 1. That is 62 pages of information to look at the foundation of my whole program. Okay? The big book uses 40 pages to cover the next 11 steps. Joe told you something earlier. The foundation of everything that I've ever done in this program, and every will do, and every action I take or will not take, is based on my truth in step 1. It's the foundation of the whole program. What if my foundation is weak? That's why the book spends so much time on step 1, because 2 through 12 are acts against your will, and if you don't have an experience based on and find your truth in step 1, you won't do 2 through 12. You'll say things like, oh, I don't want to write inventory, or I'm struggling with God, or I'm at a meeting today. Well, I'm struggling with the 3rd step. No, you're not. You've never looked at the 1st step. You see, when I got through looking at step 1, I began to do what the book said. I begin to seek recovery with the desperation of a drowning man. That's a little bit of a paradox from what I hear in meetings that take your time. I never tell an alcoholic, take your time. Book says, Mark, seek recovery with the desperation of a drowning man. But I want to share with you where you find step 1. And I want to tell you that it's the foundation of this spiritual arch through which you get to walk a free man and a free woman. The foundation. Look at your experience with booze. Look at your experience with booze to find out your truth in step 1. And the book takes a tremendous amount of time to look at that. Because the people who wrote this book knew something about me and you. We won't do 2 through 12 till we're taken to a state of hopelessness inside ourselves. The book uses the word convinced. So that's where you're going to find step 1. Again, we agnostics up through the ABCs is step 2. The chapter on how it works is steps 3 and 4. Into action is steps 5 through 11. The chapters on working with others is step 12, and the last 4 chapters tell us how to practice these principles in all our affairs. You see, this is a basic textbook. If you go into chapter 5 and read how it works, you're trying to compute calculus, and we don't even know how to add and subtract. So we're going to start at the front of the book and go through this basic textbook. It is not designed to be read as a novel. It's a set of exercises designed to transmit a spiritual experience. So that's the table of contents. That's the process we're going to go through.
In the preface on page XI, which has been updated each time they print it, it'll tell you that this is the 3rd edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous. It'll tell you that the first edition appeared in April 1939, and in the following 16 years, more than 300,000 copies went into circulation. I'd like to mark that. I'd like you to mark that between 39 and 1955, 300,000 books went into print. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. The second edition, which was, it says in 1955, reached a total of more than 1,150,000 copies. Now, this preface was written after the 3rd edition in 1976. This book has become the basic text. I'd like to bring up the idea that maybe the most important word on this whole page is that this is a textbook. They're going to tell us more about the main purpose of this book. They're going to tell us the main object of this book. But it's good to get an idea. And keep in mind, from the title page where we started with the circle and triangle, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism, up to the doctor's opinion, we're just looking at general info about the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. But a lot of times, especially in small communities, when you start to think AA is just this little group that meets down at this club, you know, and you're in your first 30 days and you think that's AA, just from this preface and the first 3 forwards, you can get an idea of the scope of Alcoholics Anonymous and how it's reached. I can't tell you, standing in Jack Murphy Stadium this summer with 55,000 alcoholics at the International, my third International, and I'm standing next to Dr. Bob's son and the chairman of the board of the General Service Board, and the guy that runs the General Service Office is at the podium, and he says, "This is the largest meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous ever," and the whole crowd just went crazy. There was a connection to AA that gets me out of my little small... It's almost like every 5 years AA gets really small for me, and the International just blows it wide open. So the idea that this is a textbook is very important. A couple lines down it says, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program, so that tells you where the recovery program is located, it's been left untouched in the course of revisions made for the 2nd and 3rd edition. The section, the doctor's opinion, has been kept intact just as it was originally written in 1939. I have to tell you there's a mistake there. There's a big mistake there. Because on one hand, in that flyleaf, they told me the message of Alcoholics Anonymous is contained in page 1 through 164. Those of you in general service, follow me on this because it's a very important point that's coming to light and nobody knows how it ever happened. If anyone here has ever seen the first edition, we're talking from 1939 to 1955, page 1 was not Bill's story. Page 1 was the doctor's opinion. And no one knows, all the way up to Frank M., the archives chairman for the General Service Office, your archives guy, nobody knows whoever gave permission to take page 1 off the doctor's opinion and Roman numeralize it. Because what people will say now, doctor's opinion is not in the first 164 pages. It's not relevant. Well, it was, and nobody knows who changed it. So when they say here that let me read it right, doctor's opinion has been kept intact, you better ask your delegate who gave him permission to change it. And page 1 to Bill's story and Roman numeralize the doctor's opinion. The second edition added the appendices, the 12 traditions, and directions for getting in touch with AA. But the chief change, really, in both of these, first and second edition and the third edition, was made in the personal stories to reflect the fellowship's growth. Then it'll tell you about which stories were kept and which stories were left. Then on the next page, XII, it'll tell you about what went on with the third edition and how they changed the stories, added stories, new stories, to reflect the fellowship's growth. All changes, and then the last paragraph, all changes made over the years in the Big Book, AA's found nickname for this volume, have had the same purpose, to represent the current membership of Alcoholics Anonymous more accurately, and therefore to reach more alcoholics. If you have a drinking problem, we hope that you may pause in reading one of the 44 personal stories and think, yes, that happened to me, or more important, yes, I felt like that, or most important, which I'd like you to mark as a question that I believe needs to be answered somewhere in the... It's the only question we're not required to answer when we get to it. I think this question should be answered before the third step is taken with whoever you might be working with, is do you believe this program can work for you?
Forward to the first edition. Now, the other thing is, just by virtue of time, Joe and I aren't going to be able to go through every word in this book. But going to the forward of the first edition, this first paragraph has always also been so important to me because at 3 years sobriety, when I first got exposed to it, I had no idea what it was saying to me. So I want to read it. It says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered. Now, those of you who raised your hand that you're always going to be recovering, the book, this is the third time it's used the word recovered. So again, I'll have you go back and ask yourself, where are you getting this belief system that you're always going to be recovering in this program?
And this is the forward as it appeared in the first printing of the first edition in 1939.
So it says, who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body.
We're going to break the first step down and take those in those parts, one at a time. First we're going to look at the body, then we're going to look at the mind.
Now highlight these two words, to show other alcoholics. Now I'm going to introduce you to squiggly lines. Every word in this book is important, but when you see squiggly lines, pretend it's a neon light. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book.
A lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous do not know that that's the main purpose of this book.
So precisely how we have recovered. Fourth time it's mentioned that. It's the main purpose. It says for them, we hope these pages will prove so convincing no further authentication will be necessary. Meaning, maybe, if I'm willing to sit down with a new drunk and take him at least through the doctor's opinion, up through page... The first time the Big Book tells me to go try controlled drinking, if I'm not convinced, is page 31. So there's 41 pages of information I'll take any drunk through before I'll tell them to go take a drink again, because maybe they'll have the experience I did. Maybe these pages were so convincing that I only had one option left, which was to seek God, and therefore there's no further authentication, meaning maybe I don't ever have to drink alcohol again. Maybe these pages will be so convincing no further authentication will be necessary to me. We think this account of our experiences, not our knowledge, our experiences, will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend the alcoholic as a very sick person. Besides, we're sure our way of living has its advantages for all. Look at what this paragraph has just shared with us. 100 men and women who recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. The book will show me precisely how to do that. Maybe the pages are so convincing that I don't have to drink again. The alcoholic is a sick person, and we're going to be shown a way of living. I've been in AA for 3 years, had skimmed over this paragraph a couple times. Today I see that there's so much in that paragraph for me.
That'll be great with that on the last paragraph of the foreword. We shall be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book. That's what they want you to get from this book. They want you to get results. Particularly from those who have commenced work with other alcoholics. It's very important. The foreword to the second edition, as it appeared in 1955, described the fellowship as it was in 1955. So there'd been 16 printings of the book from 39 to 55. Any of it. The story stayed the same, 164 pages. Actually, in the first edition, it's not the 164 pages. It's 184 pages, from the doctor's opinion to the end of A Vision for You. This will tell you that since the original foreword to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship at his destination. Already, continues the early text, 2s, 3s, and 5 of us have sprung up in other communities. Now, I asked you to mark back on the foreword to at the first page of the preface, that between 1939 and 1955, 300,000 copies of the book went into circulation. Now, in the second paragraph, I'd like to address another important statistic. 16 years have elapsed since our first printing and the presentation in 1955 of this second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed to nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Here's an interesting statistics. One person recovered for every 2 books that went out. Now, why is that true from 39 to 55? And you think one person recovers for every 2 books that go out now? What did they do different between 39 and 55 that they stopped doing from 76 to 95? Well, they used to take you through the steps before they brought you to the fellowship. They used to take you upstairs and take you through the 8 steps, or Dr. Bob would have you down in his office, or such and such and such and such, and you were brought to recovery before you were brought to fellowship. And their recovery rate was 1 person for every 2 books that was printed. Now, why has that changed? Why has that changed now to the rough estimate they say about 6%?
Why in Houston, Texas in 1993 did they sell through Intergroup 33,000 Desire chips and 1 year later sell 3,000 one-year chips? Because of what we're talking about. Because they went to the fellowship first and heard all this stuff that we keep talking about, which has absolutely nothing to do with this message. And alcoholics are dying as a result of that. Because the message they're hearing when they go to the fellowship is not the message out of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because you cannot transmit something you've got. And if you're sitting in meetings and have no experience with the book, you're trying to transmit something you haven't got. I've said this before. I refuse to be an accessory to murder. I will not mess around with an alcoholic's life. The recovery to alcoholism is contained in this book. You see what I'm saying? Everywhere I go, I pick up statistics. And what I find from intergroups around chips, we're down to a 6 to 7 to 8% recovery rate. You see? And there's a reason why.
The rest of that paragraph will tell you how from 1939 to 1955 it grew in other states, it grew in other countries. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron in 1935 during a talk between Bill and Bob. 6 months earlier, Bill had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups. That was Ebby. He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. Silkworth, who was a specialist in alcoholism who was now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members. Why would they say Dr. Silkworth was a medical saint to us? Because the information that he transmitted to Bill and Bill's experience with it. See, we always think this has all happened from alkies to another alkie. The whole program comes from non-alcoholics, but it happens between you and I, one alcoholic talking with another. The first step comes from two non-alcoholic doctors, Silkworth and Carl Jung. I don't know who they got the idea of the unmanageability and the spiritual malady of the third part of step 1 from. They got the other 11 steps from the Oxford movement, which was a really strict religious group. Let's look on page 292. We were talking about this during the break. On page 292, you see the 6 steps as they were originally written. And you'll see really the only thing left out is the explanation of the problem. And all they knew about step 1 was that it took complete deflation. That was step 1. Then they knew the rest of what we needed: dependence and guidance from a higher power. We needed inventory. We needed confession. We needed restitution. And we needed to continue work with other alcoholics. But they didn't have the knowledge of the problem. And you're going to find at the bottom of page XVI when Dr. Bob that Dr. Bob had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. But when the broker, Bill Wilson, gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he'd never been able to muster. From hopelessness came hope. From admitting you have no power comes power. When Dr. Bob got knowledge and experienced the hopelessness of his condition that came from Bill Wilson and the information he got from Dr. Silkworth, he never had another drink. It's kind of hard to go to the solution until you know what the problem is. It's kind of hard for the solution to really work until you have a clear first step. And I'm going to throw this in there. If we can all agree the 12 steps are a spiritual process, I'm going to tell you this. If you start a spiritual process with a lie, you don't get better. You start a spiritual process with the truth, you get better. I'll give you an example. Our groups worked with people who came to AA that belong in Al-Anon, my girlfriend included, who got talked into alcoholism and did the work, did the steps based on being alcoholic. They get to the 9th step and they're crazier. We've had people sent to our group that are really addict, and we help them find out they're alcoholic. We've had people sent to our group that find out they're both. We've had people sent to our group think they're one, find out they're the other, do the work based on truth, and they get better. Do the work based on a lie, you get crazier. That paragraph tells me that Bill and Bob were unable to stay sober until they had the explanation they got from Dr. Silkworth. That's why Dr. Silkworth was so very, very important.
I want to comment on something again. It's about an experience of step 1. I have a very, very good friend that lives in Lubbock, Texas. His name is Bobby W. Bobby W. has been around this program about 12 years. Bobby W. at one time was a pro basketball player. When I met him, he had gotten out of the penitentiary for the second time. And the longest he'd ever been able to stay sober, as he called it, was 3 years. Now, I'll tell you what the problem was. The problem was that he was a drug addict, and he didn't want to go to Narcotics Anonymous. He went to Alcoholics Anonymous, so he couldn't stay clean, couldn't stay off drugs, because his truth was he's not an alcoholic. He never relapsed on alcohol one time. Finally, the last time, he almost died with a heroin overdose. I'm happy to tell you that was 8 months ago, and I had been telling Bobby for 3 years. I did some work with him. You will not stay sober in Alcoholics Anonymous because you are a drug addict, and you must go there for identification. That is where your problem is. And he called me up, and he's now 8 months clean. He goes to NA, he has an NA sponsor, and he said, I wish to God somebody had told me this. I at least told him that. So it takes me back to what Joe's talking about. Here we're going to give you some tools to find out your truth. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. You see? But Alcoholics Anonymous is for alcoholics. I've known a whole bunch of people coming in. I mean, I can't even conceive of this. It's like some people think it's neat to be an alcoholic, for God's sake. You know? Trust me, if I found out my truth, I wasn't an alcoholic, I'd be doing something different. This is a fatal illness I have. But the point Joe's trying to make is the hopelessness. I got to find out what's wrong with me in step one. I got to have an experience. Here's another interesting thing to understand. Dr. Bob had tried spiritual means for years to quit drinking and couldn't. And the book tells us why. See, he didn't know what was wrong with him, so here's what his problem was. He never pursued the spiritual means with any form of consistency. He would do it for a little while and then stop. I mean, probably the bulk. How many people in this room came into AA with a belief in God? Raise your hand. Okay, almost everyone in the room. Well, he did too. But the book says over and over again, a belief in God is insufficient. We have to have an experience with this power. You know what made me willing to seek an experience with the power? My truth based on my experience in step one. When I saw my truth, you think I'm going to sit and debate with you about God anymore? I only had one question. How do I have an experience with the power? You see?
This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. We're going to touch on the rest of these forwards. You'll find the rest of this forward really deals with how they came about with the traditions. And I think it's great that AA's traditions came out of our own mistakes and that we learned through our mistakes. And they tried everything they could. And I think the divine inspiration and the divine intervention and where it's been brought to, and that the 12 traditions work and the way they operate, and that the AA service system is really an inverted triangle and the group is still the most important. Don't ever lose track, if you're involved in general service, that your GSRs and your district and your areas and your GSO people are serving you. You're not. Don't get lost in thinking you're serving them. We had a great thing in Group Conscience one night in our group, because I'd told them in stuff that I'd told them, and my sponsor had told them when he did a seminar on the 12 traditions for our group, that a question could literally go from our group to the General Service Conference and come back. And so we put that to test. And we sent the question that I raised earlier about the doctor's opinion being Roman numeralized. We sent that to our GSR in our Group Conscience. And she took it to her district meeting. And her delegate got a hold of it, and she took it to the area. And the area told her she should take it to the General Service Conference. And the General Service Conference said, "We don't know. Let's ask Frank M., the archives guy from GSO." And a direct answer came back through our delegate to our GSO from Frank Mauser, the archives guy. And they said, nobody knows who gave permission to change. And the answer to our question came all the way back. And it was a great experience to see. And that they're really there to serve us, and we're not serving them, and that the group is the most important. And you go a little step further with that, and the individual in the group is right behind that. The forward to the third edition will basically give you the history from 55 to 76. Now they're talking about 1 million copies and 28,000 groups. They'll change those numbers as the editions come out, and some of you have different numbers and different statistics as they've changed. I guess the bottom paragraph really sums it up when it says, "In spite of the great increase in size and span of this fellowship, at its core, it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope." Anything about the forwards before we get into something I'd like to cover tonight before the doctor's opinion? No. Okay. We're going to break the first step into 3 parts tomorrow morning. And we're going to look at it like this. Mark already talked about this, but let me just say one more time. We're going to look at body from the doctor's opinion. We'll call this section 2. We're going to look from the doctor's opinion to the top 2 lines on page 23, and there is a solution. And after that, there won't be anything more about the craving. And we're going to use that whole section from the doctor's opinion to the top of 23 to just look at the craving. And then we're going to use from 23 to 43 to look at the obsession. And you won't find anything more about the obsession pretty much after page 43. Then we're going to use just a couple pages in We Agnostic. It's really hard to find people in this country that know about. They'll show you where to find the craving. And they'll show you where to find the obsession. But you ask them, well, what pages in the book deal with the spiritual malady, the unmanageability, the second half of step 1? And they don't know where in the book to look. And we found 3 specific pages that deal with the unmanageability, the spiritual malady, and untreated alcoholism, which I believe are all 3 the same thing. And we're going to use all of page 44 and half of page 45 and a middle paragraph on page 52 to look at the third part of step 1. So for your own view of this, just picture the first half of step 1 in your mind, the way it's written in the short form on page 59. We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. I thought the dash meant fill in the blank. And I thought it meant fill in the blank with whatever's true for you, and here's what was true for me, and the way I wanted to write it. Yes, I admit that I'm powerless over alcohol and drugs, and that's why my life has become unmanageable. So now that I'm not drinking or using anymore, everything should be just fine. Thank you very much. Because I didn't know, I thought that the unmanageability was connected to being powerless over alcohol. And I thought my life was unmanageable when I was drinking. And now that I'm not drinking anymore, I should be able to manage it until I saw the second half of step 1 has nothing to do with the first half of step 1, unless you're still drinking. Now that you're sober, the dash means these are 2 separate ideas. That I'm powerless over alcohol and my life has become unmanageable, sober. There's a thing you've heard whenever you hear more about alcohol. In California, they read so much at the beginning of the meeting, it's all lost its meaning. And they read so much that they read more about alcoholism, and in there you'll always hear the delusion that we are like other people, or presently, maybe. Presently, my life is unmanageable. I would hate to say to you, but I would also, you've got to take that one step further. I would hate to say to you that I'm 13 years sober and I'm powerless over alcohol and my life is unmanageable. That's my problem. If that's the problem, where have I been brought in 13 years? I have power over alcohol and my life is manageable, and I better know who that power comes from, because I ain't drinking and I got power to manage my life. How do I do that? So I need to remember where that power comes from. But if I was powerless over alcohol, I would be in the other half of this room tonight rather than in this part of the room. And if my life was unmanageable, I wouldn't be able to tell Leon 6 months ago, I will be in Battle Creek on Friday night, October, whatever this is, Friday the 13th, right? And if I was still in superstition, I wouldn't be here on Friday the 13th. Especially in Battle Creek, Michigan, with a few of you that are in this room, I wouldn't be... So we're going to take the first step in 3 parts. Let's take it like this. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, body and mind. That our lives had become unmanageable, spirit. So we'll break it down in those 3 parts starting tomorrow morning. But tonight, I'd like to talk about the difference between drug addiction and alcoholism.
Let me say one thing to address what he's talking about. I want you all to consider looking at that from the state you're going to be in tomorrow morning. The state you're going to be in tomorrow morning. Okay, we admitted we're powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. This for me, when I go back through the steps, when I look at the allergy of the body, yeah, you better believe I got to go back into me and my drinking. When I look at the obsession of the mind, the unmanageability of my life, I better be looking at it from right now today. I mean, there's this thing going on. The way we're going, half the country will be on Prozac pretty soon. My experience with depression, it was a manifestation of a spiritual malady. And when I did this work, God treated that. So when you come in tomorrow morning and we look at that, I want you to consider the idea that we're going to look at being mentally powerless tomorrow morning in the state we're in and the unmanageability right now. You see?
You got people that are alcoholic. You got people that are addict. and you got people that are both. That doesn't mean they're the same. We're going to take the criteria that we're going to use from the doctor's opinion to the top of 23 to look at the craving. And I want you each in your own way to look at the craving with alcohol separately from the craving with drugs. And just look at when it was you and booze. Did this craving happen? When you put alcohol in your system, did you crave more alcohol? Then I want you to look at the craving with drugs. And here's what I find, because I'm going to, as we go through this right now, I'm going to share the truth that I found. Because I did heroin for several years, and I shot cocaine for several years, and I did more drugs than some of you in this room that are real addicts. And I'm not an addict. And I'll tell you how I came to this. See, me saying that my length of time with drugs or the amount that I did makes me an addict would be like you saying, because you drank a lot, you're alcoholic. Well, we're going to find in here a guy that's described as a hard drinker who's over there in that bar right now tonight who can drink tremendous amounts of booze, can drink some of us under the table. It might gradually impair him physically and mentally. It might even cause him to die a few years before his time. And he has a habit for alcohol, has a habit, very interesting word the book uses, has a habit for alcohol badly enough to gradually impair him physically and mentally, but he's not an alkie. Because all he needs is a sufficient reason. Make up his mind. Ill health, falling in love, like my dad, the warning of a doctor, change of environment. This man can stop. Then we have a real alcoholic who might not even be as bad as the guy over there who could drink some of us under the table, might not even be as bad as the continuous hard drinker, but at some stage of his drinking career, he begins to lose control over the amount once he starts. He gets this craving, and a sufficient reason by itself would not be enough to keep him sober. He can't make up his mind about alcoholism. And my God, some of the ways we heard some of the ways we hear alcoholism referred to nowadays in AA, they make it sound like this disease is something you can make up your own mind about. Where I live in Southern California, in all these meetings you hear, we just don't drink no matter what. I mean, if I could just not drink no matter what, why would I be here tonight? I would be home in Santa Monica on the beach doing wonderful things for myself, just not drinking no matter what. It's almost the opposite. I'm here because I drink no matter what. Not because I can't drink, because I drink no matter what. Right?
Let your experience show you your truth, you see.
So, in going through the craving, I saw the craving for drugs and I saw the craving for alcohol. So far, I'm an addict. Then we get to the obsession. And all that has to do with is one question. Write down this one question, which is really what the top of 23 says. I'll read it the way the top of 23 says, because a good textbook is going to end up with a summary on this part of the disease. And what the top of 23 says, if turned into a question, and we needed to probably say that's the most important principle we're going to use with this book from now on, once we get to the doctor's opinion, we're going to turn every statement we possibly can into a question for you. And at the top of 23, if you turn it into a question, the way it's read will be like this. Does your experience abundantly confirm that once you put alcohol in your system, something happens which makes it virtually impossible for you to stop? You'll find that from the bottom of 22 to the top of 23 if turned into a question. So all you need to be clear on to go past page 23 with booze is, does your experience with alcohol confirm that once you put it in your system, you lose control over the amount, and you cannot tell when you're going to stop, when that craving's going to stop? And if you want to break it down to a simpler question, here it is. Do you lose control over the amount once you start? So I look at that with booze, and I look at that with drugs, and I see that so far I'm an alcoholic addict because I get the craving for both alcohol and drugs. Now we get to the obsession. And the obsession has to do with, can you keep yourself stopped once you stop? And you'll find the bottom of 43 sums it all up at the end of that section. It sums it up by saying, at a certain time, there will be no defense against taking that first drink. You won't be able to keep yourself stopped, and the power of God needs to be there. And neither you nor any other human being is going to be able to provide that defense. It must come from a higher power. In the short form, the question would be, can you control the stop once you've stopped? Can you keep yourself stopped? Would even be the shorter question. So all you need to be convinced of in looking at the obsession is, can you, on your own power, without God, keep yourself stopped? And here's what I came to. I woke up one day and decided I never wanted to shoot heroin ever again. I walked away from it, and I never shot heroin ever again. On my own power, without help or God. I then got involved in cocaine, and some people would say, well, you're just an addict that went to another drug. Not true. I woke up one day and I said, I don't like the way this stuff is making me feel. I'm not ever going to do cocaine ever again. I share that with a real addict. He says, man, I did that 100,000 times, and I couldn't stay stopped. I walked away from heroin and cocaine when I made up my mind to, and never needed any help, and couldn't quit drinking for 18 years. I'm not an addict. That's all that I used. I get the craving, because most addictive drugs will give even my mother a craving. She's not an addict. My mother's freebase is a little cocaine. She's going to crave a little bit more, but she's never going to do that ever again. She's going to make up her mind. And I've sat with real addicts. Here's another example. Guy comes over to my house. He says, I'm 7.5 years in the program, and I'm an alcoholic addict, and I want to do this work. I said, great, let's do the work. We get into the doctor's opinion. He comes back the next week. He says, man, I need to tell you something. What's in that doctor's opinion does not happen to me with alcohol, but it does with freebase cocaine. I said, how come you've been saying you're an alcoholic for 7.5 years? And he said, the saddest thing I've ever heard, to be that long sober. I could see 7.5 days, 7.5 years. He said, the reason I've been saying alcoholic for 7.5 years is because they told me I am. And I thought, my God, nobody ever gave you the grace and dignity to find out your own truth. And he found out his own truth, and he had a reason to do the work. He's an addict. He's about as much alcoholic as the man in the moon. If both were the same, how come there's all these alkies that can take or leave drugs? If they're both the same. And how come if they're both the same, there's all these addicts that can take or leave alcohol? That doesn't mean we give permission to addicts to drink booze and not get away with doing drugs. Because if they drink booze, they're going to go to what they really like. And that doesn't mean we're giving alkies permission to do drugs, because when they do drugs, they go to what they really like.
What they have no choice over.
And you're going to hear this stuff in AA where people will say, my drug of choice was cocaine. Next time you hear someone say that, ask them, is it possible that the drug you think you was your drug of choice was your drug of no choice? And you'll see that this idea of choice is one more idea that's been filtered into our program that by people who don't care about us, who aren't our friends.
How many of you have sat in meetings and used this phrase, my drug of choice is? Raise your hands. Okay, I'll have you consider that that's your drug of no choice. If it was your drug of choice, why in the hell are you at the meeting? Just choose not to use it. It's your drug of no choice. I'll tell you what my drug of choice is. It's Excedrin. I can buy as much of it as I want. I won't hide it from anybody. If I take two and don't like the results, I will never buy it again. I'm like Joe. I have a 20-year history with alcohol and a 13-year history with dope. Did so much cocaine one night that I went into respiratory failure. They had to jam a needle full of nitro in my heart. And here's what I did. They took me on a flight for life ride. I was in the hospital 5 days. I get out. I still remember walking out the front door of the hospital. I put my hand in the door. Here's what my head says. We lived through that. Let's go get a drink. Now, I've done about every kind of drug you can do, but I woke up one day and said, I just call, for me, drugs were alcohol enhancers. And I woke up one day and said, I'm never doing drugs again. Now, I have a physical craving. You put any kind of drug in my body, but I do not have a mental obsession because I woke up one day without God and said, I'm not ever doing that crap again. I don't like what it does, and I've never done it since. I am an alcoholic who is powerless over where drugs will take me if I put them in my body.
And being powerless over drugs is not the same as being a drug addict. And being powerless over where alcohol takes you is not the same as being alcoholic where you crave more booze. Here's the analogy that freed me up. Follow me on this. Take you and a normal drinker that you can think of. I always think of my mother because she can have a drink and a half. Or I think of my girlfriend. She can have a drink and a half, which I cannot comprehend. Right? I heard a lady the other night in a meeting. She said, I'm alcoholic because I know the price of a drink in a bar. And I thought, I no more relate to that than the man in the moon. I have never had a drink in a bar, and I do not know the price of a drink in a bar because I gave it all up. I was also at a meeting last week, and I thought it was interesting, and I had to comment in the meeting. Somebody said, put the price of a drink in our meeting basket. And I got up to speak and I said, you might as well just start putting the deed to the house, the title to the car, the family, the friends, the money. Right? Put the price of a drink in the basket? I'm sorry, I don't have it. Never did have the price of a drink. Right? So here's the analogy. Think of you, a non-alcoholic that you can think of, a normal drinker, and 98 other people from anywhere in the world that you want to pick. Put them all in a log cabin for 500 days and shoot them with heroin 3 times a day. How many of those 100 people, including the non-alcoholic, my mother, how many of those people will be physically addicted to the drug heroin after 500 days? Every one of them. Now hold back their shot for 5 or 10 hours. What happens to every one of them? Craving, withdrawal, whatever you want to call it. Now give them a shot of their drug. What happens to their craving?
Goes away.
Goes away. They use words like you got well, got sick, the bogue's off, whatever you... I got well. Right? I know the terms, right? Now, let's take me, my mother, and 98 other people from anywhere in the world and put them in a log cabin for 500 days and pump as much alcohol as you could pump into somebody through every orifice that you could possibly pump it in for 500 days. How many of those 100 people are going to be alcoholic? Every one of them? There's a difference. 10%. That's what statistics say. Would we have made my mother, who's not an alcoholic, into an alcoholic? You either are or you aren't. Okay, and then my sponsor says, now we got to find a way to get those that aren't out. And he says, you tell them anybody that wants to leave can leave, and everybody that wants a lease on the place can stay. Right?
So 90 of those 100 are going to leave, and 10 of us want to marry the person that put us in there. The real alcoholics.
So we got the non-alkies out of there, and we got the 10 alkies. Hold back their booze for 8 or 10 hours. What happens to every one of them? Withdrawal, craving, whatever you want to call it. Maybe to different degrees. Some might go into DT, some might shake, some might be at cess, some might just be uncomfortable. But they're all going to go into withdrawal. Now give them their drug. What happens to their craving? What happens to your craving? There's a difference.
Exactly.
We just found about 4 differences between an alcoholic and an addict. The basis of these programs, NA, CA, AA, is one alcoholic talking to another or one addict talking to another. You put an addict across the table from an alkie, and he starts talking about getting well after he puts his drug in his system. The alkie's going to sit there and say, something ain't right. I don't identify with you. Drug talk doesn't work for an alkie. Drug talk starts talking to an alkie, you lose him. He's gone. He doesn't feel right in the very place where he belongs.
I heard this the other day, and I looked at my experience, and it was my truth. And this is what I heard. The addict does dope to escape from reality, and I drank alcohol to try and live in reality. There's a lot of differences. I don't know, it's been said that the treatment center with one van started the idea that alcoholism and drug addiction are the same. I don't know that, but I believe you better take a look at it.
He's cold.
I believe you, but now I work at a treatment center too. I believe you better take a look at that. Am I an alcoholic? Am I an addict? I challenge you to look at the belief system. If you're sitting in this room and never really looked at it, if you just bought somebody's story, the book gives you a very clear way, Joe went through it, to find out, am I an alcoholic, am I a drug addict, am I a both? I mean, I sat in AA for 3 years telling you I'm an alcoholic and an and I remember one time Don said to me, Mark, are you a good sign painter? And I said, no. He said, well, why don't you introduce yourself as an alcoholic addict and a shitty sign painter? And I knew him well enough to know he was making a point. I said, what's your point? He said, my point is this is Alcoholics Anonymous. Why don't you show some respect for it? This is singleness of purpose. He said, I don't think you even know what you are, which irritated me, but it was the truth, you see.
Read what Bill wrote. Read what Bill wrote in Problems Other Than Alcoholism. Read what Bill wrote in Open and Closed Meetings, the difference between the two. Because there's no addict in the world that's not welcome in any open AA meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I believe if you're not alcoholic, you don't belong where they should at least be respectful. And I heard a guy in California say one time to me, he came into my living room and he said, in Alcoholics Anonymous, in a closed meeting, I say alcoholic out of respect because I know I'm an addict. And I said, you're not doing that out of respect. You're doing that out of disrespect. It's terribly disrespectful. Because the guy that might need to hear somebody might get lost when he hears you. I was in a meeting one time, and they didn't introduce themselves at the beginning of the meeting, nor did they really talk about the substance they were talking about. And I listened to this man talk about his problem, and I wasn't sure what he was talking about, but I really related, and I walked up to him afterwards, and he said, "Oh, I'm not alcoholic. I have a problem with sugar, but I just love coming to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous." And I thought, my God, what if my life was on the line? I also was in a meeting not too long ago where they had nothing on the wall, no book. I walked in a little late, which I usually don't do and I don't like to do, and they weren't introducing themselves, they were just sharing. And after about 20 minutes, I wonder, is this a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous? And somebody shared, and she said, you know, I think I'm the most selfish, self-centered person in the room. And they started to debate. No, I am. No, I am. And I absolutely knew I was in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Only in AA would people find virtue in being the most selfish, self-centered person. I mean, imagine a Lions Club meeting or an Elks Club or the Rotary or a Women's Club, and they get virtue out of, I'm the most selfish, self-centered person in the room. It wouldn't fly, right? Only in AA would that be a topic for conversation. No, I'm the most selfish, self-centered person in the room.
Today
we can stop there.
Yeah.
We had some opening comments and some stuff to get off of our mind, and basically we've covered from the title page up to the doctor's opinion. And for lack of a better way, we'll break the book into pieces or sections. We've basically covered section 1, which is not step 1 yet. It was just some great general information about the program. We talked about the title page. We talked about a 3-part program, Unity, Recovery, and Service. We talked a little bit about a 3-part disease, which we're going to cover this morning, which is the first step, body, mind, and spirit. We talked about a part of the program for each part of the disease. Bring the body to the fellowship. Bring your mind to the recovery process. Bring your awakened spirit to be of service in the program and in the world, and that becomes one. We talked about a program with 36 spiritual principles, 12 traditions, 12 steps, and 12 concepts. They gave us 3 legacies. When I found that out at 6 months, it opened the whole program up to me, and I found out I wasn't in it. I was in 1/3 of it. We talked about the table of contents and basically the pages we're going to use to look at the first step, which we'll cover this morning, where you find the second step, where you find steps 3 and 4, where you find steps 5 through 11, and chapters that can be used to look at step 12. We talked about the preface, this being a textbook. We talked about growth from 39 to 55 in the fellowship and how it grew. We talked about the main purpose of this book is to show other alcoholics precisely how to recover. We talked about recovered. We talked about questions that are current myths in Alcoholics Anonymous and ideas like, can you recover or will you always be recovering? Do you have a choice over alcohol? We spent a long time on the difference between alcoholism and drug addiction. Basically, all this stuff with step 1, though, comes down to your own personal finding, your own truth. Step 1 is about finding your own truth. I got to tell you, I had a lot of confusion when I got here, and I'd been to 10 treatment centers. And I had a degree in psychology, and I had been a therapist in a treatment center up in Lansing. And I didn't know what I was. I knew a lot about alcoholism, and I didn't think I had it. I knew a lot about drug addiction, and I thought that's what I was. I knew a lot about how I felt, and I knew a lot about myself, and it did me absolutely no good. I couldn't stay sober. Knowledge got me nowhere. Information did nothing, just confused me. I had more to unlearn to get to step one. Sometimes we'll do this and we'll talk about the simplicity of taking one piece of the first step at a time. Body, mind, and spirit. And basically for each of those there's really only basically one question. But sometimes people will come up and they'll say, my God, the first step sounds so complicated, when it's basically just a couple simple questions. And sometimes what feels, and it feels complicated, is filtering through all the stuff that needs to be let go of to get to one simple question. For example, we're going to look this morning from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23. If you want to mark where we're going to stop looking at the craving, we're going to stop looking at the craving after the first two lines on the top of page 23, where it says the experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. And you'll find pretty much after that, they won't talk much about the craving in this book. They'll talk about booze and they'll talk about drinking a little bit, but pretty much the best stuff that we've been able to find in the groups that we come from to cover the physical craving, the allergy to alcohol, even though these pages will get into some other stuff like in Bill's story and stuff, the best pages we have found are from the doctor's opinion to the top of page 23. We'll call this section 2. We'll call it the body. Excuse me. Basically, by the time we're done, we're basically only going to come down to one question. And here's the question. Does your experience abundantly confirm, right from the top of page 23, right to the bottom of 22, that once you put alcohol in your system, something happens which makes it virtually impossible for you to stop? Shorten that question. Do you lose control over the amount once you start? Even shorten that. Can you control the start? Can you control the amount once you start? And sometimes with just that simple question, it feels really complicated because you got to filter through all this preconceived stuff that I already have in my mind. I used to give lectures on THIQ and neurotransmitters and chemical enzyme reactions in the body of an alcoholic. And to get to step one, I had to literally continue to use that prayer. Dear God, please set aside everything I think I know about alcoholism and this craving and this book and these steps and myself and you, God, so that I can have an open mind and a new experience. I hope those that are here for more than information this weekend tried that prayer in their own words, in their own way this morning.
I'm Mark. I'm an alcoholic. A couple other things that we ask you or introduced you to, I think, that are important to mention is, one is the path of consideration, which means when posed with a question that may challenge a belief system that you had or challenge something you either have or haven't done, to sit with that, to not answer that your ego uses an answer to shut off considering anything. We also talked about there's a part of us that must defend itself all the time. And if you hear something that is different from that which you have been doing, that part of you will go into action to defend itself, and you'll start to get angry, and you'll start to get judgmental, and you'll start to get critical, and you will have no new experience behind that. And I talked about a paragraph that's so important in my life today on page 55 of the Big Book. You know, it occurred to me, if you go through this book, you're going to see the word attitude mentioned many times in the book. Matter of fact, when you get to 11th step, for example, it says that prayer and meditation works if you work at it, and it says if you have the proper attitude. And the thought occurred to me today, what is this attitude they keep talking about? Well, the attitude is described on page 55, and then basically what it tells me is this. There's three components to it. One, Mark, are you willing on a daily basis to lay aside prejudice? And if you look up the word prejudice in a dictionary, it means preconceived thought or opinion. Mark, are you willing to lay aside prejudice, think honestly, and search deep within yourself, Mark, Search deep within yourself. And the promise is that if I'll do that, I can't fail, and it tells me why. The consciousness of my belief, meaning my relationship with God, will come to me, and I will get the answer. So we introduce you to those two ideas. The path of consideration, proper attitude, is described on page 55 of the big book. Something I just want to read a little, it's kind of a little story that ties into what we're going to discuss, powerlessness, and it's called Green Beans. It says, it has occurred to me that even though I like green beans, I do not have a problem, nor am I powerless over green beans. I say this for the following reasons. I cannot tell you the last time I ate green beans and how many I ate. I'm not planning the next time I will eat green beans or how many I will eat. I do not know if I have any green beans in the house, and if so, where they may be. I have never hidden green beans around my house. I have never lied about how many green beans I ate or what I did when I ate them. I have never forgotten what I did after eating green beans. I have never embarrassed or abused myself or my family after eating green beans. I have never stolen money from my employer to pay for green beans. I have never cheated on my wife after eating green beans. I have never been stopped by the police for driving while eating green beans. I have never been unable to stop eating green beans once I started. Now, none of these things has ever occurred as a result of eating green beans, and I think I can safely say that if any of them did occur, I would have serious reservations about ever eating another green bean in my life. And yet all of these things happen when I drink alcohol, and I thought they were perfectly normal. Now we're going to talk about the doctor's opinion. A couple other things that are, I think, important. One is, we've talked about in the big book, we're going to take statements and turn them into questions, and Joe and I will show you how to do that. Anytime the book makes a statement, turn it into a question and lay your experience alongside the question to answer it to discover your truth. I've given you the tool of put your name in. Make this book personal. Put your name in. Forget about the word E. Either use your name or use the I word. Pay attention when you see the word if, and pay attention when you see the word it. Know what it means. So a little quick history on Dr. Silkworth. There was an excellent